I do love me a good roguelike, but as many others I've grown wary of the genre. If a roguelike does not manage to put its hooks into you, they can be incredibly boring. The Foglands is a VR roguelike that released nearly a year ago for the PSVR2 and the Quest. I did not check it out back then. I do like this whole sci-fi western theme they've got going on, but lackluster reviews and my own wariness towards the genre made me skip this one. So recently the devs reached out to creators saying that they are looking for reviewers focusing on the narrative and exploration aspects of the game, which did spark my interest because how many roguelikes focus on narrative and exploration? After having played the game a bunch, I do get where they are coming from. Narrative and exploration are indeed the strongest features of this package, even though they are by no means perfect, and we'll talk about that. But that's not how reviews work. We cannot only cherry pick the positives, we'll also talk about the things I did not like, and oh boy, this game has problems. I am playing on a PSVR2 here. There is a Steam page for the game and I asked if the PC version is still planned and the answer was yes, but there's no ETA. I wouldn't hold my breath, to be honest. A human settlement on a distant planet has fallen to calamity. A toxic fog is encroaching over the land, killing everything in its way. Humanity has fled underground, but even there, safety is far out of reach. A giant monster has made its home in the depths of the mines, threatening to topple the very foundation on which the last remnants of mankind is built upon. You are a runner, one of the brave souls that enter the depths to protect humanity from that what lurks below. Unfortunately, on your very first run, you meet your demise. But that is not the end of the story, that is just the very beginning. A strange fella rescues you from the cold grasps of death and offers a deal that is not to be rejected. You will be offered protection from death and special powers. All you have to do in return is to kill the creature which threatens to destroy the entire settlement.
You're an honest man of your word like me, ain't you? We can consider this a legally binding verbal agreement, don't you think?
If you've played any roguelike, the structure of the game will feel very familiar. You have your hub where you buy meta progression upgrades and gear up for your next run. On your run you navigate a series of rooms. Each room is pre-built but they come in a randomized order. During your run you will get temporary upgrades in the form of fate cards. There are 3 floors with a boss at the end of each floor. You continue down until you die or until you defeat the 3rd boss. Either way you end up back in the hub. The narrative structure is heavily inspired by games like Hades. Each run will give you tidbits of lore and world building and some dialogue lines with the game's characters. That's a good thing. Each piece of media is inspired by other media that came before, so you might as well borrow from the best. But structure is not everything. While Hades has a very interesting and big cast of characters, here everyone, except the stranger maybe, is just very generic. They never have anything interesting to say, it's all just trivial dribble at the best. Sometimes the dialogue is straight up cringeworthy.
I can't find your hand.
Oh man, I should have figured. Sorry. That's awkward. Let's pretend that didn't happen, okay? I'm Shondine, Sabretooth, and you?
It's really hard to get invested even if you try. I suspect most players will just ignore the story completely, and that's a problem for the entire game structure, which is heavily narrative centered. We'll come back to that later. The character design is also very inconsistent. These two are fine, but Ursa here has a completely different art style that does not fit the world they are trying to pitch here at all. But the story will pick up pace eventually. It's pretty standard stuff. The big bad beast might not be the bad guy after all. Maybe we just dug too greedily into its lair and there might be a better option than to try and kill it. You've heard all of that a million times before, but at least it takes a direction to follow. To progress a game, you'll have to progress the story, which means you'll have to go to a certain point in the dungeon and watch some cutscene and exhaust all dialogue options back in the hub. Most of the story progression takes place right after the second boss. You'll have to beat her like 7 times in a row. It's most efficient to abandon your run right after the story cutscene. You won't make any further progress on that run anyway. When in doubt, look at the pause menu, it will tell you what to do. When you have progressed through all of the story beats, there will be a different boss, the true final boss at the end of the 3rd floor, and you're done, you've beaten the game. I really do appreciate what they were trying to do here with a narrative-centric approach. Unfortunately, I think it failed for several several reasons. First one being that it takes way too long for the story to pick up pace, and all dialogue you get until then is just so bad. It tries to be funny most of the time, but it's really not, or at least it's not my kind of humor. That's a bit subjective, I guess. As story is the main thing that drives progress in the game, it would have been important to reel players in earlier. I did get invested into the story a little bit near the end of my playthrough, but that is just way too late. The second big failure here is that story progression is so disconnected from gameplay progression. The fact that continuing your run after a story cutscene won't progress your game in the slightest feels very unsatisfying. It feels like the story and gameplay are two separate entities here that do not touch. For example, the game is called the Foglands. That is because, according to the lore, the world is consumed by a toxic fog. But that's not in the game. There's no fog. Well, there's a lot of fog effect, but that doesn't do anything. Another example. In the story, you'll make friends with the second boss and start working with her. That's not a big spoiler, it's pretty obvious from the start. But even as she joins you up in the hub, you'll still have to fight her every run down in the dungeon as if nothing happened. Another example. You get some lore blurbs about some of the enemies you encounter. For this guy here, the lore says that they are not aggressive unless provoked. But in-game, they will absolutely attack on sight. That is just not working. You have to integrate these things into your gameplay that just don't happen here at all. But before we get to that, the gameplay, let's talk about the other big pillar the game is building upon. Exploration. When you venture down into the dungeon, you'll have to clear a set of pre-made rooms that will be arranged in a randomized order. Some of the rooms are quite expansive. The exit is usually easy to find, or one exit, there might be more than one, but there will be secrets hidden inside. And by secrets I mean meta progression currency. So there are two currencies here. One is called Fog Ichor that can be farmed, and the other currency is called runner keys. And for those you'll be looking during your exploration. There's a limited number of runner keys all hidden throughout the rooms you'll be clearing. Some rooms have different variants and each variant can have its own runner key. So if you come across a room that seems familiar but somehow different, there is a reason to re-explore. There might be another runner key. Most of the keys are hidden, often in hard to reach places. Sometimes you have to do a bit of platforming. Sometimes there's even a bit of puzzle solving. All very simple but good. Simple but good. I can very confidently say that exploration of new rooms was by far the most enjoyable part of the game for me. And there's a lot of rooms. There really is a lot of different rooms. But as much as I enjoyed this part of the game, it really doesn't go well with the roguelike structure. No matter how many rooms there are, you will encounter repeat rooms pretty quickly. The longer you play, the more rooms you have already explored, the less exploration is left to do, and the system slowly sizzles out of existence until you only run through rooms that you have seen time and time again.
Let's make this quick, alright?
I think we have done our due diligence. We've talked about the narrative, we've talked about the exploration. Let's now talk gameplay. Let's talk about the roguelike mechanic. Let's talk about combat. Let's talk about boss fights. Let's talk about the bugs and the crashes. Before each run, you'll get geared up in the hub. You'll always get a revolver for free, everything else you'll have to buy with scrap. The currency you'll find down in the dungeon. There are 3 more firearms you can unlock, also with scrap. You'll have done that very early in the game, as scrap is plentiful, you'll be swimming in it in no time. Geared up, you'll ride the elevator down into the dungeon to explore, loot, and to fight the monsters. The dungeon can be a bit of a maze and runtime varies wildly. Sometimes you move through a single room and directly find the elevator to the boss arena. Sometimes navigating a single floor can take up to an hour. I don't mind that, that's fine, but it would be far better if the player had some control over it, with a map for example, so that you can decide whether to descend as fast as possible or to explore more to stack up some upgrades. Between 2 rooms will always be a short transition hallway, which I suspect is a masked loading screen, but in the middle of that transition corridors, the game will also fade to black for a second or so, which is a bit jarring. Combat in this game is very simple. There are 4 weapons, the revolver, a shotgun, an SMG and some kind of charger weapon. I found the shotgun and the charger weapon to underperform vastly compared to the revolver and the SMG in every possible scenario, so realistically there are 2 viable weapons to choose from. The weapons all have a simplified manual reload. They are all one-handed, so dual wielding is possible, but I'm personally not dexterous enough to use that to my advantage, and manual reload is a natural enemy of dual wielding anyway. There are no different fire modes, enemies don't have weak spots, combat is as simple as it gets, but it works, it gets the job done, and at least the revolver and the SMG feel good to use. Enemy variety is decent enough, no complaint there. Every enemy fills skills is niche. There's a standard melee monster that is easy to kill, but you'll have to make sure not to get swarmed. They have a variant that will throw green goo you'll have to step out of. There's a simple range guy, you can avoid its shots by strafing. There's a shotgun dude you'll have to keep at a distance, and there are a bunch more. At the end of each floor is a boss fight, which range from being pretty good to being unmitigated disasters. We talk about them a bit later because they make a great segue into the bug section of this video. There's also melee combat in this game, and that is a bit of a problem, because a lot of the meta progression, we'll talk about that in a second, focuses on melee. But melee sucks in this game. It's really not a viable option at all. There's only one melee weapon, this wrench. You cannot adjust your grip, which seems to be way too high. You'd grab it further down to create more force through your swing. You cannot block, you cannot parry. It's pretty much impossible to fight enemies without getting hit yourself. You can make it work against the weakest of the bunch, but once you get to stronger enemies it quickly falls apart, and against the bosses melee is just impossible. So why would you even try if you can just shoot everything from a safe distance? The only advantage I could think of is ammo preservation, but ammo is so plentiful, I always have more ammo than I'd ever need, so that's not really an argument. The description of the game says that it has chaotic bar fight style combat, but it really has not. Writing it in the description won't make it happen if there's no system in the game to support that playstyle. It is so much easier to just shoot everything from a safe distance, so that's what everyone is going to do, that's how everyone is going to play. You can throw your weapon, when you time it right you can throw and force grab the weapon back to throw it again. It's kind of a funny gimmick. The devs in vain try to make it more than that, dedicating a good chunk of meta progression to it, still only a funny gimmick. Then there's this whole tab here, with different explosives, all of them completely useless. For one, the grenades have the tiniest explosion radius in the history of grenades. It's very hard to actually kill anything with them, but the real problem is logistics. See, you only have 4 belt slots for equipment. I always use one for my main weapon. I usually bring the wrench, not for melee combat but for smashing crates. One spot I reserve for a healing item, and the last spot I dedicate to a fuse, which are keys you can use to unlock some doors down in the dungeon. There's no way a grenade is worth more than any of these items. There would be an easy fix, just make the grenade stackable so you can have 10 or so on one equipment slot, or give the player more equipment slots, maybe a dedicated grenade slot. Then I might have considered bringing some on some runs, but sacrificing one of your 4 equipment slots for a single grenade? No way. There are some explosive barrels you can shoot, but they basically do no damage to enemies, so there's no point. In some rooms there's oil on the floor you can set on fire. I don't think I ever managed to kill an enemy with that, but I did set myself on fire once. The point of all this is, if you're looking for a VR game with a deep and satisfying combat system, this is not the one. They try to make combat varied by adding some different options, but most of them are just not viable. Gunplay works good enough though, it's simple but perfectly serviceable. Well, most of the time. There are some very wonky hitboxes on the environments. This grate here, for example. See, you can shoot through here, but not through here. What the fuck? Railings are even worse. It's not only that you can't shoot through them, they'll also block shots above them, and you never really know where you'll be able to shoot through, and worse, where the enemies are able to shoot through. But enough about combat. Let's talk about the more satisfying things in life. Loot. Down in the dungeon you'll mainly collect scrap. Scrap is lying on the floor, it's inside breakable boxes and in loot crates, which can be very hard to open, especially if they are higher up. They really should snap open when the lid is halfway or so. Anyway, you will lose all your scrap at the end of the run, but there are vents to send it up to the hub where you need it to equip yourself for the next run. The other way to spend scrap is via shops you'll find down in the dungeon. Shops are nearly completely useless, because they don't offer anything that you can't get back at the hub. They mainly offer weapons, but you will only ever need one weapon and you will bring that from the hub anyway. You can buy grenades, which are useless. You can buy fuses, which I did 1 or 2 times, but you can also find them lying around and you really only need them very rarely. The only halfway useful thing you can buy is a healing spray. But in all my time playing, I think I bought only 1 of those down in the dungeon, because it's quite rare that it is actually on offer and I always bring one anyway. So the chance that I use the one I brought and I need another one and then happen upon a shop that happens to have one on offer is so slim. The shops here are the biggest game design failure I have seen in a while, in a long while. Imagine a roguelike that has your shop to spend your in-run currency, and these shops never have anything useful to sell. I said earlier that you'll be swimming in scrap in no time. That's because you'll always send everything up the vent because there's no use for it down in the dungeon. There are two different shops you can encounter which both have exactly the same useless stock on offer. They do have different dialogue lines, but they never have anything interesting to say anyway, so I really don't see the point. The most valuable thing you can find down in the dungeon here are these purple chests here that contain fate cards, which provide boons and last until the end of the run. You get to choose one of 3 that are randomly drawn. It's the same system as in every other roguelike out there. Fate cards are divided into 3 categories: guns, hands and keys. Having 1, 3 or 6 cards of one category unlocks an affinity, which you can view through the pause menu. I wish there was a pop-up or anything in game that notifies you when you unlock an affinity, but there's not. You'll have to go through the pause menu from time to time to check if you don't keep track yourself. Affinities are all pretty useful and there are many fate cards that synergize with them, so you'll have to pick and choose. This fate card might have a better boon, but the other one counts towards an affinity you desperately want. Some synergies are pretty powerful and will increase your survival chances considerably. Hell, some fate cards alone are extremely powerful, like this one that will slow time when hitting an enemy while falling. You can just jump and shoot to have unlimited slow time. I like that the game is not afraid to give you overpowered stuff, though I'm not really sure if this card is intended to be used like this, but it doesn't matter, it's fun. That right here was a complete and unabridged boss fight, by the way, and that's a good thing. Never be afraid to make the player feel powerful. Boss fights won't look like that on your earlier runs, obviously. In the exploration section earlier we talked about runner keys. These unlock new fate cards that will have a chance to get offered to you down in the dungeon. The whole fate card system is pretty good, I enjoyed it. One problem though is that many fate cards boost melee combat, and melee combat in this game is so useless, especially in boss fights, and that is the only reason to choose fate cards, to make yourself strong enough to survive the boss fights. So every card that does not help towards that goal is wasted. Once you have unlocked every fate card that seems to be useful, you will actually weaken your character by unlocking any more. Meta progression should never make your character weaker, unless it's a deliberate system to increase difficulty, which is not the case here. There really should have been a way to deactivate cards you have unlocked so they won't appear in your run anymore. That way you'd have the satisfying collect them all mechanic without sabotaging your character progression. A point that many roguelikes struggle with is to use the randomness of in-run upgrades to force a player to adapt different tactics and playstyles each run to keep it fresh, and yeah, the Foglands struggles with this part as much as so many others in the genre. There are some locked rooms you will come across down in the dungeon and you can unlock those permanently with runner keys. I advise to do that first because these rooms always have a purple chest in them, and most of them, or all of them, not quite sure, will also give you a new runner key. And these locked rooms will also give you a little bit of world building. The big downside here is that once you've seen all of these scenes, they will play on repeat and you cannot leave the room while they are playing.
What were they doing down there that made it? It burns.
If the rumors I've heard are true, I don't want to know.
Sometimes the purple chests will offer health, scrap or fog ichor instead of a fate card. The fog ichor is always a viable option. It's a second meta progression currency. You only get it from those chests or from boss fights. You can use it to upgrade your character back in the hub. You can upgrade your health, melee damage and thrown weapon damage. You can also upgrade each of the 4 firearms, namely their damage and their ammo capacity. It's hard to come up with a more boring weapon progression system. Seriously, try to think of a system that is more boring than this one. I bet you'll struggle, but it gets the job done in making you feel more powerful over time, so it works, it's okay. In most roguelikes, you will discover or rescue some characters down in the dungeons that will then open shop in the hub, offering more diverse ways to progress and to play. Here it's, yeah. So you will do the same thing. There are 3 characters that will over time populate your hub. When this little fella, the Mineman, turned up, I was really excited because the game was pretty simple until then and I was looking forward to a new vendor. But he doesn't do anything except to give some lines of dialogue. The 2 girls at least progress the main storyline. The Mineman just has a little side story, and by story I mean some lines of dialogue that is just really silly. I'm utterly confused why that is even in the game.
Oh, Jim! Wow, this is so unexpected.
I promised a few words about the boss fights. There are 3 bosses, one at the end of each floor that you'll fight multiple times, and then the final boss. The first boss I think is pretty good. He will spawn lots of ads you can choose to ignore or to cull. He will summon wooden spiky things from the ground that are telegraphed by red circles. Sometimes there will be an orb that shoots at you. Destroying it will stun the boss for a short time. It's all decent mechanics and I generally enjoyed the encounter. The second boss, oh boy. The first time I encountered her, I died. That was absolutely fine. The second time the fight bugged out. She was just standing there and I could not hit her, so I had to abandon the run. As compensation, the next 2 encounters, she bugged out just standing there, but at those times I could hit her and was just gunning her down. If she works, she spawns some shadows of herself, a mechanic that at some point in my playthrough just stopped working altogether. I fought this boss so many times and the fight worked as intended, I don't know, maybe twice? What a mess. What an absolute mess. Then there's a giant worm. I honestly couldn't tell you if it was bugged. You have to destroy 2 things by throwing other things into them, which takes about a minute, and then it was just sitting there doing nothing. I have to assume that it was bugged for me, but yeah, I don't know. I won't spoil the final boss fight, but I will say that it was the easiest and worst of them all. A spectacular disappointment. But the boss fights are not the only buggy mess here. Often enemies would bug out just standing there. At least one of the fate cards doesn't work. This one says that shots won't consume ammo while in slow time, but they still do. Having one fate card that is so obviously bugged always made me question if the others do work as intended. For some of them it's not so obvious to see if they are in effect. But worst of all are the crashes. The game did crash a ridiculous amount. I did lose count at some point, but I'd say about every 3rd or 4th run the game crashed on me, and the crash would always delete all progress you made during that run, so you'd lose all meta progression currency you collected. I was never afraid of the enemies or bosses or chasms in the game. They could kill you, sure, but they couldn't destroy your progress. But I was always afraid of the crashes. So much so that I often abandoned my runs just to secure my fog Acra or runner keys I had collected, out of fear to lose them to a random crash. So listen, it is very rare that I give such a definitive non-recommendation for a game. If it weren't for the abysmal technical state it is in, it still would not be a good game, but I would probably have said something like, yeah, it's a studio's first project, they missed the mark here, but the game does have some good ideas. There are some redeeming qualities here, so maybe get it on a discount. And there are redeeming qualities. The voice acting is actually pretty decent, the music is great, the exploration, finding the hidden nooks and crannies is enjoyable, combat can be fast paced and sometimes, just sometimes it comes together and begins to flow right and then it's good fun. But with the technical state as it is, I just cannot recommend it. And the game is out for nearly a year, they are not going to start fixing it now. Don't buy this.